Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my show.
Here's a familiar childhood trope.
You started it! 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 You started it!
Admittedly, I started it on a snowy February day in 2010. I began documenting the growth of my first daughter, Lexi, when she was 2 years old, penciling in her height on one of the walls of her bedroom. And then, the next year, I added her little sister Vivian as a baby. I had documented their growth as someone who helps to shape these little bodies, inadvertently giving them permission to document their own growth as authors of their own little bodies. At some point, the two acts physically merge, their own marks maturing, growing more focused and intentional, overriding by writing over my own authorship of them. A resurgence of free play and free-range movements is encouraging parents and caregivers to encourage their children to gain agency through unstructured experiences with their own and othered spaces and places. Playing in a vacant lot, walking alone to school or to a friend's, children hone their autonomy, embrace risk, and situate themselves among other guardians of independence, such as, in my case, their parents. In this episode, I explore ways of making such agency through the lenses of my two daughters' experiences with free play, particularly Lexi's early literacy practices mediated by diverse material surfaces, fixed surfaces such as interior walls and an alleyway blacktop that she transforms through these signifying practices. Fixed surfaces are not simply physically fixed by their infrastructure, but also by the ideologies that construct their various purposes. Walls, for example, are inherently static. They are physically put up to theoretically stay up. Their purposes can be to fortify, defend, and confine, keeping their spaces tightly controlled. But defending walls can at times offend. They can exploit the ideological boundaries of their own making by pushing back on the control they have been constructed to uphold. Intimately bound to any public space, they can encourage participants to remediate that space, to loosen it from its fixed purposes. Urban design theorists Karen Frank and Quentin Stevens defined loose space as one that has been appropriated by citizens to pursue activities not set by a predetermined program. For a site to become loose, the authors say, people themselves must recognize the possibilities inherent in it and make use of those possibilities for their own ends, facing the potential risks of doing so. As other children do, my own girls explore such possibilities by taking creative risks in and on spaces considered tight or unsanctioned by some authority. Spaces such as their own bedroom walls, furniture throughout the house, and their own skin. These spatial rhetorical practices demonstrate my daughter's tactics of writing on spaces, thus writing themselves into spaces, inscribing their own agencies. Their work has fostered my own. Undermining dominant patriarchal models for raising girls, I encourage these practices and consider them an evolution of generative literacy skills. My casual observations over the years have revealed a now complicated, layered exploration of more than just how children use unsanctioned physical surfaces for signifying practices. They have encouraged me to consider the liminal and hyphenated surfaces of father-scholar, daughter-subject, daughter-scholar, father-subject. These subjectivities are themselves unsanctioned spaces within traditionally masculinized approaches to research. A couple of other literacy father scholars are helping me return to pre-digital definitions of multimodality and their implications for children's ways of making meaning and agency. Gunther Kress, for example, says that children make meaning in an absolute plethora of ways, with an absolute plethora of means in 2, 3, and 4 dimensions. These ways involve different kinds of bodily engagement with the world, that is, not just sight as with writing, or hearing as with speech, but touch, smell, taste, feel.
How to make a baby bumblebee.
You're making a baby bumblebee?
Uh-huh. I want to make a rhyme.
You want to make a what?
I want to make a rhyme.
A rhyme?
We're making ducky.
A ducky? Well, you have lots of things that you want to make. Looking at his own daughter's early literacy practices, Stephen Hill echoes Kress. Multimodal ways of building children's narrative, he says, often involve a combination of many different modes children use, such as gesture, speaking, singing, drawing, and writing. Through these ways, children construe and reconstrue their world, weaving together real and imagined events, characters, and feelings.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my show. I made a masterpiece, so I would like to sing a song about my masterpiece. It is called Lexi's Masterpiece, written by Lexi, illustrated by Lexi, wrote by Lexi. Thank you. Oh, Mr. Masterpiece, masterpiece. I would like to congratulate my little masterpiece.
And I would like to add to Kress and Hill's conversation another mode of making meaning, the surface upon which kids have different kinds of bodily engagement. Surfaces through which they reconstrue their world, surfaces that they have yet to factor into their budding genre knowledge. I'm following the definition Carol Birkencotter gives with her work with Amanda Thien, following her earlier work with Thomas Hucken. It's a definition of genre knowledge that attends to the tacit understandings of the decorum of the moment in response to the contextual cues of a particular setting. My daughter Lexi has grown to understand this ideological sense of appropriate literacy activities performed through appropriate and sanctioned behavior on appropriate and sanctioned spaces. Within such structured spaces, according to Birkenkotter, children learn to mean in the context of tools and artifacts, genres, and contextual clues. But I want to embrace the surfaces in certain contexts where children are still learning by simply playing with tools, artifacts, and genres, perhaps without any clue. They are surfaces that children are trying to make appropriate for themselves, to loosen from their tight construction, regardless of their being assigned inappropriate and unsanctioned by us big people. These are the surfaces that simply call to us, that simply want to play. Play is certainly one of the ways that children make meaning, according to psychologist Susan Engel, as they construe the world and navigate the boundaries that give shape to their experience. These boundaries are, of course, sometimes quite material, tightened by parents and others' concerns for kids' safety, well-being, and future. And children eventually gain the genre knowledge of navigating such boundaries, spaces, and concerns, just as much as they do traditional literacies and their forms. Knowing where to go, when, and how, and all the other aspects tied up in that knowing, grows out of understanding how learning to know is part of an ideological system that adults rely on to navigate their own experiences. As Kress notes, one of the problems with trying to understand the ways kids do things is because we're trying to fit them within our own ways of seeing, when children at various stages of their lives just don't see things that way yet. Kress says that when children are developing early literacy skills, they are in charge. They choose the materials which best serve their sign-making purposes. They construct the signs as plausible, apt expressions of their interest and act transformatively on them. In this process, they also produce their own materials of representations, which often depend only very indirectly or not at all on the adult's systems. As an adult, and as someone who is deeply invested in his own children's literacy skills, I have a challenge ahead of me in trying to make sense of those skills. I want to see that my children know that they know. But Kress cautions me. He says, the incredulous response to attribution of intention is quite common in relation to things that adults do naturally, automatically, unreflectingly. He later advises that our adult eyes focused on children's meaning-making have not permitted an understanding of children's actions in their terms. Children's interests have been invisible because of the dominant power of adult interests. Susan Engel agrees. This is about children's interests, children's experiences, and the ways they see them, the ways they navigate them. They haven't learned the adult ways of doing things, the mature forms of genres, because they haven't picked up on clearly defined purposes for any one way of doing things, of any one genre. Genres, of course, can take many forms for kids. During play, a screwdriver can become any method of inscription, but we can also imagine how a child can use any tool to inscribe a message on a sign. It is simply what the child has at hand. There is nothing to say, of course, that adults can't or don't do the same. They certainly do. But we are more aware or are more concerned with the consequences of such behavior than our children. Though many of these forms, objects, spaces, and surfaces are certainly fixed by the ideologies of such consequences, children can unfix them by discovering creative uses with what is already around them, what is already at hand, and situate themselves among such things and spaces for their own varied purposes. Play theorist Simon Nicholson discusses such things at hand and the creativity children use to manipulate them. Creativity, he says, is the playing around with the components and variables of the world in order to make experiments and discover new things and form new concepts. Nicholson calls these variables loose parts. In any environment, he says, both the degree of inventiveness and creativity and the possibility of discovery are directly proportional to the number and kind of variables in it. Environmental psychologist Leanne Rivlin adds that these are elements within a site that are amenable to manipulation and change, as well as having the potential to lead to creativity and discovery. It is easy, then, to situate the idea of loose parts within loose spaces, as we revisit the definition provided by Frank and Stevens, whose tightened spaces are made loose by participants who must recognize the possibilities inherent in them and make use of those possibilities for their own ends. It is not simply then a matter of taking advantage of loose parts that are already there in a space or provided for creative use, such as by a teacher in a classroom. It can be a matter of children's appropriating elements that have inherent purposes and revising them for different purposes. But saying all this buys into the idea that play can indeed be purposeful, that it can be intentionally meaning-making beyond simply playing itself. Play theorist Stuart Brown defines play in part as apparently purposeless. Play activities, he says, don't seem to have any survival value. They don't help in getting money or food. They are not done for their practical value. Play is done for its own sake. But someone's apparently purposeless playing assumes that the player seeks no practical value. That, however, doesn't mean there isn't practical value in the playing. It might emerge unintentionally, Brown says, even later in life. Children or anyone playing at a particular moment may not intend for that play activity to offer any future practical value, such as this kid who was put up on a swivel chair to perform in front of others, a space that is otherwise an unsanctioned one, a dangerous, rickety chair that if the child had been seen standing upon on his own would certainly have been scolded. But at this point, the chair has been given sanction by someone for the benefit of a now sanctioned behavior, a little performance by a cute kid. At that moment, this kid is just playing. But that moment of just playing may later open another moment of so-called real-world purpose, encouraging the, in this case, grown child, just as cute with less hair, who has put himself in front of others, his students, to make meaningful connections between that moment of play decades ago and the present moment of practical value. It is inventive without intent. It is retrospectively heuristic. Play activities can perhaps unknowingly create the kairos for an opportunity and a space that has yet to be realized. But sometimes children realize that they have been given the opportunity and the space to play, even when the giver didn't intend to give it. My wife is calling to me to come upstairs to see what our daughter has done in her bedroom. Now, as someone who studies forms of rhetorical, tactical underlife, my reaction is not the same as my wife's. Wow, Lex! Look at what you did. What is that? That is a circus, Lexi says. That is Lexi's first encounter with drawing on a wall, as far as I know. And so it is the first encounter either her mom or I have had with how to handle it. My wife agrees that, yes, this is a circus and it's time to send in the clowns to help clean it up. But first, I have to set up a portrait of the artist as a young graffitist. Her mother, on the other hand, wants it gone, and later in the day, Lexi helps to erase it. Lexi's drawing on walls became more prolific, as did drawing on other surfaces. These are, according to Kress, merely representational images of a sign maker that one day may work their way into more communicative modes.
Masterpiece. Masterpiece.
Drawing and writing on the walls eventually moved to drawing and writing on paper posted to the walls in forms of directionals and maps, announcements of shows she and her sister like to put on, and most recently, a welcome to their new little brother, Max, posted all over the house. This transition, of course, did not happen overnight, but I did note a couple of years beforehand one of Lexi's first attempts at performing a representational communicative event showing evidence of embodied genre knowledge on what eventually became a sanctioned surface. You'll remember Lexi's height. Well, this is Jane, and this is Jane's height. Many of the unsanctioned spaces throughout the house contain Lexi's representations, scribbles and drawings and things that may make sense only to Lexi, though I began it with a form of communication. Now, I did not knowingly sanction the surface per se, but participated in a genre often applied to such a surface, recording height. Lexi may have deemed it appropriate herself because she saw that I had done so. She was also transferring the knowledge of what it means to record a measurement. She had done so with Jane, and later on began to add to my own marks of her measurements. Interestingly, very few communicative gestures ever appeared directly on unsanctioned surfaces themselves. They were mostly representational. Once Lexi started getting the idea of communicative genres, she for the most part abided by their decorum. You do some things on paper and then put the paper on the wall, which means having access to yet another surface. Paper. Lots and lots of paper. Paper itself soon became an unsanctioned, tightly controlled surface by the authorities, her mom and me, after Lexi began borrowing sheets of paper from the forbidden printer. And it is her learning this difference between appropriate and inappropriate uses of certain surfaces, the rich rhetorical understanding, that is starting to have real purpose for Lexi. She is learning how to be an actor within an ecology of surfaces, attempting to negotiate the ideological factors wrapped up in it. My wife teaches high school theater and had recently directed a production of Shrek the Musical. There's a princess named Little Fiona who is locked up in a tower at the age of 7. Having waited now a mere 23 days for her prince to come, Little Fiona spends her time reading stories to her dollies and, of course, putting stuff up on her walls. Guess who else was 7? Even though her mom was the director, Lexi was still going to have to prove her stuff by auditioning for the show, just like everybody else. But before her mom would for sure cast her, Lexi would have to practice with a voice coach to strengthen her singing. Weeks went by, forcing Lexi in the meantime to continually ask, "Do I get to play Fiona? Do I get to play Fiona? Do I get to play Fiona?" To supplement her plea, Lexi did what she normally does when she really wants something. She wrote a note to her mom, asking her to please cast her. And this is how she wrote it, on the wall. "Little Fiona," it says, "Mom, please." To the left of it repeats Fiona and what looks like 7 o'clock. Now this makes sense to us because the shows normally start at 7 p.m., but Lexi meant it as 7 years old, the shared age between Fiona and herself. Now, why on the wall? Why would Lexi try to persuade her mom through an action on a surface that her mom herself has not sanctioned? Wouldn't Lexi turn to more appropriate methods, like paper? No, Lexi says, you're not supposed to take paper from the printer and use it for other things. So she wrote it here. She is making meaning through an unsanctioned surface that calls attention to itself simply because it's unsanctioned. It's not supposed to be there. What better way of getting noticed? Lexi is rhetorically traveling along a liminal surface of being a good daughter who doesn't write on walls and a communicator who takes risks. One of the risks she takes is helping her father find his own ways of discovering agency. As I'm documenting her and Vivian's progress, I find myself in a number of liminal positions. How do I situate myself as a father and as a scholar? It is challenging to shut the scholar down when I need to be only a father. It is just as challenging to shut the father down when I need to be a scholar. It isn't as much as teaching children to learn the tight adult systems that help us make sense of language and genre and space, that is, to see how adults see. It is as well about our own willingness to unlearn how we see, to create a masterpiece and then dance about it, sing about it, write about it, reflect on it, see the inherent possibilities that can transform a surface into a mode of understanding others a little bit better. It is evident on a bedroom wall, where it isn't supposed to be, where we have found another place to come together, a surface on which to share our own ways of knowing.